welcome back to my channel. I've changed where I'm filming today. I actually think this might be a better location. Anyway, it's been a while. In today's video, I really wanted to review a book that I've read recently. I haven't got the book to hand to show you, unfortunately, because it's a library book and I had to return it. But the book I would like to review is called In a Different Key. It's a book about autism. It covers the whole history of autism. I don't know if any of you have read Neurotribes by Steve Silberman. It's in a slightly similar vein to that. But unlike the Steve Silberman book, it's not neurodiversity agenda. It's not pro neurodiversity agenda. It kind of takes quite a sort of neutral position. And it covers the whole history of autism. And I can't for the life of me remember who wrote the book, which is not very helpful. But if any of you are interested, just type in a Different Key into Google and the book will come up because it's a well-known book. Okay, so I'll just kind of go through. This is gonna have to be over quite a few videos. So the book sort of looks at the early descriptions of mental disorder and the words that were used back in the day that we don't use anymore, such as idiot, imbecile, moron. All of these words we don't use anymore, but these words were these were the descriptions that were used for people, particularly those with intellectual disabilities, back in the past, that obviously now we would see as very noxious, but back then these weren't seen that way. These were the words that were used. Those terms, they were coined in 1902 to describe people operating with the mental ages of respectively less than 3 years, 3 to 7 years, and 7 to 10 years. And other terms that we use that we don't use anymore were things such as cretin, ignoramus, simpleton, feeble-minded, and mental deficiency. So the book looks at those at the words that were used, and also explores eugenics, the history of eugenics, particularly in America, United States. President Teddy Roosevelt touted a eugenics manifesto called The Passing of a Great Race, which was written by his friend, the New York lawyer Madison Grant. And Grant recommended a program of mass selective breeding to rid the USA of the so-called genetic influences of the weak. And interestingly, Hitler actually liked that book. And 17 states in America legalised forced sterilisation in the 1920s. Shocking. So yeah, we often don't, many people don't realise that, how prevalent eugenics actually was in America, in the USA, in the 1920s. It wasn't just in Germany. So yeah, so the book also really looks at the origins of autism as a diagnosis, and heavily covers the first case. The first diagnosed autistic individual was someone called Donald Triplett. And the book very much looks at his life. He was Leo Kanner, the eminent psychiatrist Leo Kanner, who coined the term infantile autism. Donald Triplett was case number 1 for Leo Kanner. So it sort of looks at him and his experiences, talking about how he began school, and while he had learned to read words aloud earlier than the other children, it appeared he had no idea of the meaning of those words. I thought that was really interesting, because that was the same for me. Obviously I'm, in some respects quite different to him, but that was something that was the same for me, in that I learnt to read pretty early. I mean, certainly by the time certainly before I began school, I could read, and I was very fast. I learnt to read very quickly, at least in terms of words, putting words together, the sounding out of words, that sort of thing, the decoding. But I had no or very minimal comprehension. I lagged behind in comprehension. So, I mean, that's caught up now, obviously. I still find it difficult, but it has caught up. But certainly when I was at school, that was a big problem, and that seems to be quite common in autism. So so it's interesting that Leo Kanner's first case study had that. It's actually called hyperlexia, by the way. And it was the same with movies. He would recite lines of dialogue for weeks, but he didn't understand that the characters on the screen were telling a story. So yes, he had differences there in the use of language. It was a challenge to be friends with Donald. He got along so well with just himself for company. He said little, and he was oblivious to the chatter at high school. Now, the important thing is that Donald's parents were actually upper class and very well-known people. They were very highly regarded, upper class people, and so they could afford the very best care for Donald, which of course wouldn't be the case for many other people. That might well be why Donald was the first case study. That's not a coincidence, because his parents really, really pushed for him to be seen by the most highly regarded experts in autism, and there were only a few at the time, Leo Kanner being the most eminent. Donald was obsessed with numbers and car license plates. He had a photographic memory for them. Donald had no stage fright either when he landed a part in his school play, and he had a good memory for learning the lines. Interestingly, I don't have any stage fright either. I wonder how common that is in autism. So it looks at Donald. It also covers some other autistic individuals as well. Looking at different parents and carers. I won't go through all of them because that'll take forever. It explores the history of autism, not just in America, but also in Britain as well. And actually, Britain was the first country to organise a national society for autistic children in 1962. And it was also the first to pick a puzzle piece for the logo. A school for autistic children was set up in 1965 in London, and that was set up by the autistic charity. That was set up in 1962, and it was led by a teacher called Sybil Elgar, and she proved that these children could be educated. So it looks at parental advocacy, and this society later was changed to the National Society for Autistic Children, by the way. It was originally called the Society for Psychotic Children, because that's what, back in the day, autism was conflated with psychosis and schizophrenia. So it looks at prevalence studies for autism. A study tracking prevalence of autism in Middlesex County, London, in the 1960s was the first full sort of count. But there was an issue. Who to count? The matter of deciding whether a given individual had autism was a mess of diagnostic confusion, because there were many competing syndromes, each with its own name, laying claim to the same traits that Leo Kanner had described years earlier as being autism, for example, childhood schizophrenia. And it was no means clear that all the authors were talking about the same condition. And the outlines of the condition, its definition, had wavered continuously. And Kanner himself had fretted that the whole concept was being watered down by inconsistent standards. So this idea that what is autism? What is it? This has been a case all the way through its history. People often talk about it as being a problem now, and they talk about the widening of the criterion. Some people are saying it's gone too far, but this problem about what is autism has never actually really been conclusively determined, because there is no blood test, there's no biological marker. It often relies heavily on subjectivity in judgment, and diagnosis is very often in the eye of the beholder as well. Okay, so I'm going to move on to video number 2 now to carry on talking about the history of autism as discussed in a different key. So moving on now.